All right, I want to welcome everyone who has joined us for this evening's conversation. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, in whose offices we are meeting, and editor of Providence, the Journal of Christianity and American Foreign Policy, which is the host of this event. So we welcome all who are physically present and all who are watching online currently or later after we post this video. But we're very delighted that we were able to exploit the presence in DC by the author of this brand new book, barely available yet. It just published hours ago, The New Atlantic Order by Patrick Cohrs, who teaches at the University of Florence, but is not Italian.
Not quite, no.
But is German. So his book, magisterially, it is said, reviews the history of the crystallization of the New Atlantic Order over the last 160 years, up through the year 2020, but obviously with lots and lots of contemporary application, which hopefully he will address. So he will speak for 20 minutes or however long you want to speak.
Yes.
And then there'll be time for questions and comments later and plenty of food, so help yourselves. Thank you, Patrick. Glad you could join us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. So for me, it's a great pleasure because one of the things that I'm trying to do with this book is to offer a new interpretation of how the modern world order was transformed. That is not just something that is meant for a few historians in the ivory towers that I've just visited, because I'm at the tail end of a book tour where I started in Texas, went to Columbia, then Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Berkeley, and then Washington. But it's actually written, believe it or not, in a rather dramatic fashion. You have to get through 1,200 pages, but they should be not full of jargon and strange sort of digressions, but rather full of life, and not least full of ideas that we can distill from what I call the long 20th century. I'll try to explain what I mean by that. But the book really is at the core about the first attempt, as I see it, to create a more modern, durable, but also legitimate peace order for the world. An attempt that was made after what at that point seemed like the greatest catastrophe that humanity had ever experienced, the so-called Great War. We now know it as the First World War. They didn't know it as that. So what's particularly interesting in this context is that this kind of crisis led to a lot of questioning on the parts of those who were in power and government, but also especially on the part of those who wanted to reform societies and reform the way in which the international order was managed. And among them, not least, were many church groups and Christian groups on both sides of the Atlantic and other parts of the world who thought that the kind of system that had come into existence by 1914, where you had a lot of power politics, competition, unrepentant and unlimited imperialism that was really changing the fates and lives of many people across the globe, and where also, and this is part of the book, certain, especially white Protestant individuals, men, thought that they had such a dominant role in world history that they could decide for many other people how they were going to live, how they were going to determine their own affairs. So the kind of world that I describe in the first part of this book is the world before, on the eve of the First World War. And this is a world in which, as I hope to outline, a lot of problems accumulated that did not necessarily have to lead to a catastrophe, but it made such a catastrophe ever more likely. And by the time this happened in 1914 in the so-called July crisis, what was very striking is that those who were managing state and imperial affairs at the time, they no longer knew what to do to prevent the assassination of one heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to escalate into a global war. So we have to understand why that was so. I will talk a little bit about that. But then the second, third, and fourth part of this book take you through a long journey. Yeah, a journey of not just statesmen like Woodrow Wilson, the American president, who started out as a domestic reformer, a new freedom president, and who then found himself almost challenged to develop new blueprints for a new world order. Yeah? So he and his interlocutors like Lloyd George in the British government, Clemenceau in France, and many others. So these sort of at the top of the state hierarchy, they also had to deal with an unprecedented catastrophe. But this war had one particular quality: it sort of mobilized and animated societies, in different ways. So many ordinary, so-called ordinary people not in government, thought that this kind of gigantic catastrophe that in the end cost more than 10 million lives, especially in Europe, but also in the wider global scheme, meant that one could not return to the ways and habits and ideas of the past. Something new had to be attempted. And one of the great tragedies of this period, that I also tried to delineate in this book, was that this gigantic war led to gigantic hopes of now a peace to end all wars, a new world order that would be so just, so new, so transparent, so democratic, that from now on there would never be a war like that again. So this is of course part of the rhetoric of Woodrow Wilson, but many other, especially American activists, those who, for example, were in favor of founding a League of Nations, or church groups who thought of a new kind of Christian sort of transnational brotherhood, that should from now on provide a broader foundation for peace. All of these sort of actors, and this is why the book is also a bit longer, they all try to have an impact on what people and societies thought during the war, but especially also what happened after the end of the Great War. So the Great War ended with an armistice in the West. It did not end yet in the East, in Eastern Europe. The war continued for a long time, but in the West it ended in November 1918. So in this moment, a lot of scholars have looked at sort of the question, so what could be done, what was achieved, and what was not possible at the Paris Peace Conference. In reality, you have to imagine that the Paris Peace Conference was only at the center of many peacemaking efforts. They took place in Washington, in New York, in sort of in different spheres of the world, also at other parts of sort of the little sort of towns around Paris where certain Middle Eastern or other kind of questions were discussed. So you have to imagine that what happened, what occurred in 1919 was the most complex, far-ranging, complicated, but also kind of convoluted peacemaking process in world history. Even what had to be done after the Second World War did not quite come close, because after the Second World War, it was somewhat clearer who had won and who had unconditionally lost the war. So you had the Allies on the one hand, Imperial sort of Japan and Nazi Germany as having unconditionally surrendered, and then you had Potsdam first and then further attempts at building a new order. By 1919, you had a very unprecedented situation. So you had an American president, Woodrow Wilson, who said that for the first time now the time had come to build a global peace, a universal peace order, and who made very important speeches, famously the 14 points, but even more interesting before that, the so-called peace without victory speech that he actually he made before the United States entered this war. Because as you might know, for Woodrow Wilson and many progressives, one of the main aims that to preserve American democratic society was to stay out of this big catastrophe, and to say one advanced nation has to offer a new way forward while the others can realize that modern warfare is futile and bad and only brings catastrophe. So Wilson's original idea had been that the United States could be a kind of arbiter of peace, of a peace without victory, And this is partly conditioned by his own experience in having come from a southern background in the United States and having thought that the way the Civil War ended in the United States with an imposed peace by the North on the South was not something he wanted for the wider world. So he made eloquent speeches saying that any kind of victors and imposed peace would, as he said, rest just on quicksand. It would not be legitimate because the losers would just wait for an opportunity to turn the tables eventually. So he made all these speeches, but then you can always rely on the German high command and other Germans to make many strategic mistakes. So at this time, they thought that they could go for unlimited U-boat warfare, not against the United States, but to actually break the British blockade and to weaken Britain, which they considered as their main enemy. But as you know, in the process, they basically took into account that some American ships and other sort of vessels could be affected. So by the time Wilson made this speech of a peace without victory, he was already hardly in a position anymore to keep this going because this is not just a question of the Germans having strange ideas about an alliance with Mexico. The more important point is that the German strategy in this war had called into question the American neutrality rights and shipping rights as a global commercial power. So Wilson had to become a war-making and a warring president, and he had to adapt his kind of rhetoric to that. So eventually he would then say, some nations have to take the lead towards a new peace order. Eventually we want to include everyone, but we now have to make a peace that is first of all designed by the victors. And he tried to suggest that the victors had a kind of claim to do this because they also represented the more advanced, democratic and civilized part of the world. Now, if we take a close and a more critical look at the United States Wilson represented, it is not so hard to see that many actors around the world who listened to this rhetoric didn't find it so persuasive because he had reintroduced segregation in the White House. Many Americans at this point, of course all American women still, were disenfranchised, so were most of the non-white American men. And this was noted by many of the critics, not least the German critics who, after the war, sort of took the step of overcoming the Wilhelmine Empire and founding the so-called Republic of Weimar and crafting a constitution that was far more democratic than the American constitution at that time. They did that to be part of this new order, not as the vanquished, but as an also progressive kind of power. So Wilson had raised a lot of very major expectations, and part of what my book is trying to do, and it's a book that's written in an international key. So the United States is one actor among many. There are many perspectives in this book, but the United States perspective is very important. So what Wilson now had to do was to undergo a very harsh learning process. He was the first American president who went on a boat and went abroad to take part in a big peace conference, the Paris Peace Conference. On this boat, he had assembled the so-called inquiry group, sort of experts that were supposed to counsel him on different aspects of the peace settlement. For example, all of Eastern and Central Europe had to be reorganized. And there was this idea, yes, one should do this on the basis of self-determination. Wilson had originally said self-government. So the people should have their own government. They should determine their own affairs. Anyone who had any familiarity with Eastern and Central Europe, which had been sort of ruled by different multinational empires, the German, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, knew that it's a wonderful idea to reorganize everything on the basis of self-determination, but it's extremely complicated because you have many different competing claims for the same territory. So what do you do when you have one area where you have an intermixture of Polish-speaking, Jewish, German-speaking, and so on populations? The Americans were just beginning to have some plans for this. When they were on the way to the peace conference, that's slightly late in world historical terms. So Wilson and his advisors had to take an approach that was so different from what they had originally thought. Originally, Wilson had thought that he had so much power, so much charisma, and such a kind of soft power, we would say nowadays, that he could basically compel all the others to accept his terms, to say, we want a League of Nations, we will follow the American example, and then this kind of world order could be created. The reality was that Wilson, and this is not very surprising, had to engage in one of the most complicated negotiating process with very, very prepared and very powerful opponents and interlocutors, especially those like Lloyd George or Clemenceau, who came to Paris with delegations comprising hundreds of policymakers, experts, and they had hundreds of years of experience in what you do at in international conferences, which the American president had not, and which the American power had not, because it had kept out of world affairs, to quite an extent. It had pursued very kind of targeted, economic, informal imperialism in China and elsewhere. So it was not a kind of innocent, sort of withdrawn city on a hill by any means. But it had not made one single real commitment, alliance commitment. It had no experience whatsoever in all the kinds of things that now took center stage at Paris. So in order to understand then what happened, we have to reevaluate the American position. But we also have to do this from all the perspectives that are important at this point. So the French, the British. But we also have to understand that there were many people coming to Paris who had claims of various kinds. Today it's especially interesting that, for example, Ukrainian nationalists at this point, Petula and others, thought that a time when the Tsarist Empire was breaking apart and the Poles were trying to get, were successfully claiming that they should get a state, the Ukrainians also should have a state of their own, and on the basis of language and so on. They were basically kept at the gates of the peace conference because the peacemakers already had so many problems on their hands that they didn't want to have an additional sort of complicated negotiation about how to maneuver in creating Ukraine between Poland and Russia. You also have to remember, at this time there was still a civil war going on in Russia. It was not clear yet whether Lenin and the Bolsheviks would actually prevail. So we now might conclude, oh, this is the big time when Wilson against Lenin, and it's like the Cold War. In reality, Wilson was a powerful president. Lenin was a very brutal and hard-nosed revolutionary, but he and Trotsky still had to win on the battlefield. And so the question of what to do with Russia was a highly complicated one, and it basically was not answered in 1919. Basically, some attempts were made, but Russia remained outside this new world order that Wilson and others wanted to create. Yet one of the main questions that really preoccupied Wilson and the others was not so much Russia, it was what to do with the most powerful and a power that almost had won this war in Europe, that is the German Empire. So it had, as I mentioned, taken the step of getting rid of William II, and there were forces, social democrats, liberals, who saw themselves as liberal Western reformers who liked a lot of Wilson's ideas, but who didn't like Wilson's inference that they were sort of on a lesser sort of scale, that he had to teach them how to be Democrats. So very seasoned social democrats in Germany said, who is this American president who is coming from the southern United States and wants to lecture us who have thought about self-determination for decades and how to implement it? Further, you have to realize that Wilson made their task harder, because if you pursue reforms and you create the appearance you only do this because the victors demand it, then your legitimacy, nationalists at home can tell you are just the kind of puppets of the opponents. So one of the most interesting histories within this book has to do with the very complicated attempts of these German actors, to found a republic, a very democratic one, for example, with universal suffrage for women, for everyone over the age of 18 in Germany, but at the same time to say they did it of their own accord. Yeah, this is something that comes from a German tradition that goes back to 1848 and even further. They invoked Immanuel Kant and others. Yeah, but from a victor's perspective, the Germans had relegated themselves to a lower sort of plane of the hierarchy because they had basically allowed something like a military dictatorship, yeah, under Ludendorff and Hindenburg to take command. And this was the kind of enemy image, yeah, that also Wilson in the end propagated. So if you imagine that, yeah, after a war, which at the core was also an ideological war, yeah, where you had Western civilization against German culture, different ideas of imperialism, it proved very difficult and another sort of bout of learning now to, yeah, sort of clear the air and say, in the end, we have to negotiate. Yeah, we have to treat the others as negotiating partners. And one of the problems that emerged in 1919 and 1920 was that even the so-called victors amongst themselves, so Britain, France, and the United States, found it extremely hard to agree on most things. Yeah, so Wilson and others wanted a very aspirational League of Nations. Clemenceau said, we need concrete security guarantees, yeah, that a new German attack will be prevented by the Americans and the British saying, we give you, yeah, we vow that we come to your aid. Yeah? And the French said, if we leave this to a League of Nations and they might debate this question for 3 years, the Germans will have overrun Paris by then. Yeah? So at this time, very interestingly, it is not Americans or British, but the French who come up with a blueprint for what we now know as NATO. Yeah? So they think of a security community, but they have a very distinctive view of what is the kind of area, this geographic area, this security community was supposed to protect. They talked of a civilizational frontier. Yeah? Now we are talking about the Dnieper in Ukraine. Yeah? Is this the civilizational frontier between the Russian autocracy and the Western system where the Ukrainians are fighting for? Back then, you might guess, yeah, it was the Rhine that the French had in mind. Yeah? So they said, the German and all sort of they are not reliable. You cannot trust them. Even if they pretend to be democrats, they really just want to weaken you so they can then start the war again and win it next time. Yeah. So, and these were very important considerations. So part of what the book is trying to show then, yeah, is that out of this very complex situation, it was very hard to imagine that within a few months, a stable, durable, new kind of architecture of peace could emerge, especially with an American power that still had a lot of debates to have at home as well about, so what would be the commitments? Would the United States have a large standing army? Yeah? Would they raise taxes? All the kinds of things that in the course of the 20th century would lead to this, the formation of this gigantic American security state. If you look at the Pentagon and Washington as it is now, this did not exist at all, 100 years ago. And Wilson himself gave many speeches where he said, it's dangerous for American democracy if we become what he called a more European-style state, a military state, a strong centralized state that has the kind of projection power that he thought Britain had. So part of what happened in 1919 was that these victors and they were under so many pressures that even to craft some compromises amongst themselves, that didn't fall apart immediately, was very, very difficult. And so they, in the end, said, if we now start to do this, and then we negotiate with the Germans, then we will never get anywhere. This was one of the ideas. But the other, as the book also tries to show, in the end, this is, the rhetoric at this time was that one had to overcome the age of imperialism and hierarchy and racist ideas and civilizational Darwinism. So this is the rhetoric. The reality, as I try to show, is that a lot of these kinds of mentalities and assumptions persisted, even with someone like Wilson. So Wilson had, as a younger scholar, written a book about American democracy, where he basically claimed that only the Anglo-American white Protestant males are capable of true self-government. Everyone else is sort of less capable and has to be taught or tutored by these very advanced and very enlightened white males. In our current climate, Wilson would have had a hard time. For example, speaking at what used to be called the Wilson School at Princeton, where I gave a talk just a week ago, and where, of course, nowadays the main debates surrounding Wilson are about his racism and his undoubtedly all his the way in which he spoke of democracy and enfranchisement, but in reality, had very, very let's say, problematic attitudes towards non-white, non-Protestant Americans. This is more civilizational. This also concerned Catholics and many others. So this is, and he was not alone in this at the time. So you can find famous German scholars like Max Weber, who wrote The Protestant Ethic at this time, who's commenting on the piece and says basically, this is the time when the baton is being passed from the British world hegemony to the American world hegemony. And of course he thought that this was basically due to the ruling caste of sort of Protestants that were now it had passed across the Atlantic. So he called it the New Rome, but in a kind of Christian sociological sense. So all of these things sort of played a part in the end, making 1919 and this Peace of Paris not the fulfillment of the aspirations that many non-governmental actors had, of a truly strong League of Nations, of a truly egalitarian world order, of a democratizing international system where democracy would spread to Central Europe, to Eastern Europe, also towards the wider world. What really emerged was a very new hierarchy. It's a very hierarchical new order in which now you still have very important empires. Both the British and the French empires grew. They had new territories and spheres of influence, especially in the Middle East. The United States was in a sort of soul-searching period. So would it be the leading power of the League of Nations, or should it withdraw to what Wilson's successor Harding would call normalcy? Normalcy that he meant was the United States staying out of most world affairs, and taking care of economic interests and some other missionary interests in China, but otherwise, making no commitments to world peace or to solving conflicts in the world. Also, this question, so what would happen to an architecture of peace that was so much built on the United States having, in the end, not just to fund and support the League of Nations, but also something that Clemenceau wanted, namely an additional real security guarantee. So there was a guarantee treaty made in 1919 where Britain and the United States pledged that they would come to France's aid if an unprovoked attack by Germany occurred. So very diplomatic language. So if it could be shown that France had not pursued policies that provoked Germany to attack, then they would help the French. But as you probably know, all of these guarantees fell apart when Wilson, after Versailles, had to pass the next big test, namely a test that he had been sort of undergoing all this time, not just to envisage a new architecture and negotiate it with interlocutors in the international sphere, but also to find support and legitimacy for this new role at home. And then this was especially a question vis-à-vis Congress, where the oppositional Republicans at that time had gained a majority. So right at the time, just before Wilson traveled to Paris, and where Henry Cabot Lodge, the very experienced but also kind of tough opponent who now ran the Foreign Relations Committee, basically didn't give Wilson much of a chance to build a bipartisan consensus. But what was more important, I argue in this book, Wilson never even tried to work, sort of build a bipartisan consensus. Instead, he memorably went on a gigantic kind of bully pulpit tour to the western and midwestern states. He tried to sort of in the way he had tried to make peace in Paris, he also tried to ensure that it would be guaranteed by the United States from above. Yeah, he was trying to compel, he was trying to persuade voters to put so much pressure on their senators and on their congressional representatives on the Republican side that they would in the end have to do his bidding. Yeah, and this, of course, as you might know, not only led to a physical breakdown of Wilson. Yeah, and some scholars have always asked, so if he had not had this breakdown, would he have made it? Could he have gained the support that he needed? I would argue that his whole strategy was it made it almost impossible, because it made it easy for his opponent to say that this was, in Cabot Lodge's word, un-American. Yeah, so this international kind of commitment that Wilson wanted, Cabot Lodge called un-American. Cabot Lodge wanted a more traditional, a more targeted security agreement to France. That was fine. Yeah? So very often Wilson has been called a liberal internationalist. To me, he's he's liberal in some ways, in a very hierarchical way, as I outlined, and he's not a real internationalist because his outlook is very American. It's Americanist. Yeah, he takes more his ideas and visions from the American sphere and then tries to globalize them. There were others, especially church groups, but also, for example, the Women's Peace Party. Yeah, if you look at their leading voices, Jane Addams and others, they really tried to gain a more international kind of outlook. They were trying to see the new world, not just from an American perspective, but also from European or even colonial, non-European, non-US American perspectives. And they were thinking a bit harder about, so what would it really mean to be more egalitarian? Yeah? So to give you just one example, for these people, what they basically wanted was a very strong process of decolonization. Yeah, they said empire. Yeah, you had some very progressive forces at this time who said we need to persist with a progressive kind of imperialism because we need to help the Filipinos and others to learn how to take care of their affairs. This is a strong current that did not die with the First World War. But you had others who now thought that the time for this kind of Western US superiority was coming to an end, and who were trying to listen to Ho Chi Minh, all those representatives, the Egyptian nationalists, the Indian nationalists, the young Gandhi came to Paris. So they had voices of their own. They were quoting Wilson back to Wilson and saying, so why don't you give us self-determination for India, as one of them put it. What really occurred, however, we only can understand if we understand the power constellation of this time. So while you had a lot of voices and a lot of activists who were very audible, the underlying power structure was still very imperialist. And what did Wilson have to do at the core in 1919? He had to make compromises with the most important counterparts. And what did they represent? Gigantic imperial systems. So what came out of this, and this is not an original part of the book, but it's an important part. So there was the so-called mandate system. So Wilson thought that the League of Nations should play a role in transforming former colonies eventually into independent states. The British and South African representatives had much more detailed plans to this end, and very surprisingly, they suggested that the present colonial powers, those who were enlightened, so not Germany, not Japan, but Britain and France. And if you read Caroline Elkin's book in Harvard Now on the British Empire, you can really see how enlightened they were and how, in reality, brutal and unforgiving they often acted. But they made the argument that under the League, so certain countries should take upon themselves the burden of ruling over these territories such as Syria and Lebanon, so French, this is the French part, or Iraq and Mosul, and even to take it upon themselves to administer the new oil reserves that were found there. It was such a selfless act. It was almost Christian. So this is very tough negotiating, but they found a new language for this. So they were suggesting that humanity is in a kind of process of modernization, but it will take a long time. And as long as it's not there yet, some had to go ahead. So what you have is what I call a neo-imperialist mandate system. It has all kinds of new structures, but the power structures are still very much in the hands of those who are the guiding sort of decision makers of imperial powers. And Wilson in many ways had to accept this because he needed their support for his League of Nations. Yeah, so this is realpolitik, high international politics, that he had to learn, that he had to make these kinds of compromises. So finally, though, and this is why the book also is a bit longer, I'm also trying to show that, given what a catastrophe the First World War was, we have to understand that much more was at stake than just what this war had done. Yeah. If I outline all these problems, they take us back to the pre-war world and all the kinds of assumptions and ideas people had, that they did not just sort of nicely overcome or forget or say, a lot of people said rhetorically, oh yes, we are learning lessons, we have to do things differently. But if you really judge them by their actions, then they were using lots of nice new words while finding new ways to preserve their power. So it was a much bigger problem. A real kind of change of mentality had to occur. And I argue in this book that if we want to trace this kind of change, we have to have a much wider focus than just judging the moment of 1919. Was it good, bad? Was the peace good or bad? We have to judge whether it started a process, whether it put in place certain ideas, mechanisms, institutions that then allowed a much longer kind of reordering process of the world. And this will be the subject of my next book. So there is an epilogue in this book from page 999 to 1005, so very short, which gives the sort of outline of what I think happened between 1919 and then the more successful different attempts after the Second World War to found an Atlantic order. My next book has the working title Pax Atlantica. And again, but the question is, so how far did then policymakers and wider societies in Europe and in the United States succeed in building something more durable across the Atlantic? That's already quite a big achievement. But I also ask, was this now the main sort of hub, the main nucleus of a global order, or was it very different from the rest of the world? For example, did American policymakers of the Acheson, Truman, and George F. Kennan generation, did they judge relations with Western Europe differently from relations with East Asia, Africa, Latin America? And I think it's very important that one shows how their assumptions varied, how they respected some more as equals, almost, Europeans. So they consulted, they made common understandings for the European Recovery Program, even NATO. Of course, while being the most powerful, but more acting like a first among equals, somewhat. If you look at what American policy looked like in East Asia, it's a much more straightforward hierarchical. So vis-a-vis Japan, you don't have a trans-Pacific union. You have the United States in an alliance system. There's Taiwan, there's South Korea, there's Japan, and this clearly has something to do with also racial civilizational assumptions. So not least with the much more, from an American perspective, brutal Second World War in the Pacific. So it's a much more brutal war, as John Dowers and other works have shown. And if we look at U.S. relations with Latin America or Africa, we see, of course, far more neo-imperialist mindsets. So the same actors who think that it's important to consult with fellow Christian white Europeans, they think that this cannot be done and should not be done with Latin American actors, or if you think of the behavior even of the Kennedy administration and others in Congo and so on. This is a much more sort of a new kind of tough hegemonic approach that is justified in part by saying this is now the global fight against the communism, and we need to do certain things because otherwise the communist will take over. But as the book wants to show, the next book, and this book does already, I hope, so one of the key questions for American foreign policy and also for more broadly European and American approaches is how far do they really provide ideas and rules that can be really considered legitimate, that are really supported by others, not just because the Europeans and Americans have more power to enforce them or to coerce others to follow, but by offering something that's like a an inclusive prospect. Yeah, so there's all this rhetoric of inclusion, of allowing the world to join this kind of order. Yeah, but in reality, this kind of process was much more top-down and exclusive and exclusionary. Yeah, this is something I'm trying to analyze, why that was so. Sometimes because of real political necessities, but often, as I argue, because of the underlying mindsets of these actors who sort of saw themselves as in Wilson's case, clearly God sort of bestowed guardians of world order. And this is an aspect of Wilson's Christianity, for example, that had very, on the whole, rather negative implications for his ability to take others seriously as equals. Others who did not share this kind of background. So all these books in the end want to tell a global history, but I have many limitations. I do not read East Asian languages and so on. A truly global historian, and there are some, are really trying to put this in a global context while also incorporating primary sources and voices. What I'm trying to do is look at whatever is translated. You can still, I think, try to incorporate more. Because if your idea were that you had to be the perfect global historian, one life might be too short. And so I rather try to write one book or a few and make my way towards this. But I think in the end that teaches us a little bit of something that I think Christians should also be very friendly towards, and that is humility. So it might seem a bit strange to stand here with a 1,200-page book and talk of humility, but I think this is very important because you can write shorter books that make great claims, and all kinds of things, and are grandiose and dazzling, but that don't really stand the test of time. And so this is an attempt to write a kind of history that I hope can be of interest not just for a year or for a moment, but for a longer kind of period. So thank you very much for your attention.
Question, please go to the microphone.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. 3 questions. One, is your book available on Amazon?
Yes, but only for pre-order. You could order directly from any Amazon outside the United States, but here it's unfortunately because my publisher has a New York branch that has its own later kind of strategy, but definitely it can be pre-ordered.
Good. Second question. It seems very strange to me that at the start of World War I, you had the royal families of Russia, Austria, Germany, England, all related, their family.
Yes.
How did that affect World War I, and was there any efforts through the family to try to circumvent that? And then my last question is, what are your predictions with the current state of affairs in Ukraine and Russia? And on a religious aspect, the Patriarch of Russia, Patriarch Kirill, and Pope Francis, who actually condemned him for his support of the invasion of Ukraine. How do you think that's going to play into the future of events?
Yeah. Very interesting questions. One could give a seminar on each. So, in brief, part of what I'm trying to analyze in this book is how drastically the world changed already before the First World War. And one of the things that happened was that you still had some old structures, such as royal and imperial families, and for example, a German empire that had a parliament that had a complicated kind of elite system where some had more votes than others, yet still had an emperor who could have a role in decision making and who was not qualified to have this role, which had led to all kinds of problems. Max Weber once said, as long as you had Bismarck, one charismatic leader, this could be sort of handled, but the problem of the German system was that it relied on one such man. So he wanted a more modern sort of structure. If you think of Russia, of course, this is a much more authoritarian structure, but there too, they lose against Japan before, in 1904, not 1905. The reforms are undergoing, and of course, all the kinds of revolutionaries and opponents of Tsarism in exile, like Lenin and Trotsky and many, many others, and more liberal Democrats who are trying to reform Russia, they are sort of going beyond sort of power structures where they say, oh, we will listen to the royal family. Yeah. If you take the British example, obviously, they changed their name because they now, like many German Americans, changing their names after the First World War to more Anglo kind of names. The royal family, was caught in a situation where their first duty was patriotic and not bridge building. So they could say, yes, we want peace, but we first have to support the war effort. So in the wider scheme of things, you might know, so Wilson's idea to end the war without a victory is the most influential one, but it didn't work. Not just because the German high command still thought it could win the war, but also especially because the democratic statesmen in the West had mobilized their populations and thought, we have, this has cost us blood, treasure, we cannot just stop with a kind of, an unfinished war. We need to now go with this war to the very end. And in this kind of power structure, the role of monarchs is very, very diminished. And the longer the war lasted, the more they become peripheral. So this is part of the new kind of Atlantic order, that this kind of older monarchical structures are, can only be maintained in, if you think of the bigger powers, it's Britain. Because of a long history of a kind of adaptable monarchy that can do that. All the others, they go. The Hohenzollerns, their history, the French don't have them anymore in the first place. And there's a new Austrian Republic that becomes especially ferociously anti-monarchical. But then we have to read Robert Musil to know that there's much more going on. So a much harder terrain is the present. So this book tries to show that once we get to a situation like now, the main historian's role, I think, has to be to tell us how we got here. Because once we are in a concrete situation where so much is at stake and so much is shown to have been gone wrong for a long time, I would much rather rely on a well-informed military strategist to tell me, so what is the strategy vis-a-vis to win the war for Ukraine? So this book shows how, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes more consciously, the kinds of structures that people say they rely on to preserve peace are being corroded, no longer work, no longer function, and when you need them, they no longer are applicable. And this is sort of the constant task of statesmanship, is to keep them in place under very different circumstances. So with lots of people saying, for example, in Europe now for a long time, why do we care about military power anymore? We have the United States if necessary. Then Trump came and this equation changed. But Germany, had, I think, gone quite far towards becoming a big Switzerland, So why should we invest in armed forces? The state of the German armed forces is an ultimate triumph of pacifism, because they are, even if they wanted to, they could not even, I think, they might manage to invade Luxembourg, but beyond that, I wouldn't trust. So there's a big, and this is, I was a visiting professor 3 years ago at the German Armed Forces University in Hamburg. And it's very interesting to talk with young German officers who want to be democratic officers, but who also want to have the equipment and the kind of strategic guidance actually to do their job. And this now has to be done in a short time, so with a huge undertaking. So a lot of the lessons that we now have to learn are more, so take us back to the 1990s, I would say, and the following. So this idea, so what could one have done from the West to have a new order after the end of the Cold War that not so much integrated Putin, but integrated Russia in a way that would have avoided the kind of Putin-esque scenario. So this is, I think, the bigger question, the strategic question, where you could ask someone like George F. Kennan in my next book or others, who. So some of the assumptions, I won't even talk of the end of history and things just gravitating naturally towards the Western model and all these kinds of nice illusions, they are dispelled. Yeah, but back then, I was in Russia in the 1990s, and the Americans and West Europeans I met there, they were treating this like the Wild East, yeah, opportunity, and they were humiliating Russians. Yeah, so I think it was a very strange atmosphere. So more far-sighted leadership at that time could have maybe created a different setup. But I think the other part is, if you actually have built up a NATO system with certain rules, yeah, and certain guidelines, this is something worth preserving. And you cannot just say, well, this Cold War is over now. We are just going to disband and all of that and create something, that's maybe more cost-effective in the short term. I think the real lesson is more to stay true to these values and these systems, but to ask, so how can we avoid making them into, in the end, mechanisms where we need to go to war to preserve the independence of Ukraine, but rather mechanisms where the things like this partnership between Russia and NATO, it was not pursued in the most consistent way. And so this book also tries to show that when your deeds are, when there's a big chasm between your deeds and your words, then this raises the stakes, and it creates opportunities for populists, authoritarians, all kinds of people who point out this kind of fallacy. And if I now went into the history of US foreign relations since 2001, I mean, there's it's a long list of all the kinds of things that if I were a Chinese or Russian opponent of U.S. influence, I can say, well, I mean, we don't have to do anything. We just sit here, and they are shooting, they're almost undermining their whole enterprise in the most effective fashion. We shouldn't even interfere. So there's a lot to be done in this way. And I have a lot of colleagues and friends, for example, in Poland, who are very interested and are much more aware of these Russian problems. They have been more aware of them for many, many decades, and they weren't listened to for a long time. It was not convenient, especially not in Germany, where some economic interests like gas pipelines were more important, and where we had a chancellor for a long time who claimed that somehow one didn't need any open debate anymore. She would just take care of things. Well, that's not very democratic, is it? So I think these are the kinds of lessons that I would focus on, but I think this book also in the end is a book about what happens when a real crisis gets even more real and deeper. And it would be nice if only nice learning processes emerged from there. But I think that sometimes can happen. That, for example, if there is something like an architecture of Atlantic order that we still have, it was taken for granted for a long time, or was something old-fashioned. And then Trump, of course, didn't take it seriously at all. So we are now at a moment in a phase where we can rebuild some of that. And there's a lot of willingness, I think, on both sides. So one should go ahead with that. And this does not just mean military cooperation. It means the whole question of having more international universities on both ends, having more exchange, having more bridge building, not just also towards the kind of Russia we might want to see in the future. There's so many Russians who are now in exile in Turkey, in Eastern Europe, in Berlin, for example. So one needs to build bridges with them. You cannot just sort of shun an entire people, forever. But you also have to make clear that, if you don't if you're not clear about your red lines, a dictator like Putin will just take this as an invitation to go further. So I think the kinds of I'm very I have a lot of sympathy for profound pacifist arguments, but I've seen some of these demonstrations in Berlin, for example, and I think here that sometimes happened too, where so pacifists were trying to convince the Ukrainians to give up, so that further bloodshed could be avoided. And if you take a German historical background, this would be like saying, let's not try to overcome Hitler. Let's not have any resistance, because this will just create more bloodshed. Or why didn't the Americans stop? And why didn't they just let Hitler get on? Then we would have maybe saved some lives. This is not something that I find compatible with the kinds of values that I find important. And that's a huge political task for any leader, to actually make the case for what is necessary. And I think the most compelling political leaders we can see right now are former boxing champions in Kiev and a former comedian. Ukrainian president. Yeah, but many others have a chance to step up. But as a final note, these crises, they also reveal very mercilessly if you have very mediocre actors, because they then are completely in over their head, and now it's on world stage. And I won't name names, but if you ask me later, I might.
A question from our online audience from J.N. Kenyon. You mentioned you were optimistic about the future. He wanted to know what keeps you optimistic about the future. He also wanted to go back to the last question about the context between Pope Francis and Patriarch Kirill, and he was wondering if you could provide some background on that and how that fits into this.
Yes.
Thanks.
On the first one, if I mention optimism, it's a very tempered optimism. It's more, I would think human beings are capable of learning and moving forward. And part of what the long 20th century that I'm trying to map out here shows is that not so much after the First World War, but eventually, after in the 1940s, immense progress was made. A system was created that incorporated then West Germany, laid the foundations for West European integration, for a kind of prosperity, democratization, that is unprecedented. And the United States had a very vital role in that, also for selfish interests in part, but these were quite enlightened, I would say, policies. So the longer view of this longer 20th century, if you gives us some sort of at least hope that it's possible. But what the book mainly shows is how bloody hard it is. That it's not some nice linear, almost sort of the forces of history just work in that way, and we just have to witness them and then be happy. On the contrary, it's a lot of work, and the kinds of actors I'm most interested in are those who do the hard work. So Wilson was beginning to do this kind of work, but he was just beginning. So many others, if you think of the generation of, mentioned George F. Kennan, or this is not a partisan book. It's just they happen to be in a position of leadership in the 1940s. They had lived through in these two great wars and a Great Depression. And so it's I think unfair, as it's sometimes done, to reduce them simply to anti-communism and to say all they did was motivated by this, because some of them are very left-leaning, that it's a wide spectrum. This is something I especially try to stress when talking about U.S. foreign relations in Europe or elsewhere, that sometimes non-U.S. those who don't know the United States so well, they have a very kind of sort of black and white idea of what U.S. debates is, and if then someone like Trump comes along, it gives them a lot of pretext to say, you cannot deal with these Americans, and that's of course stupid. It's provincial, So if one comes to Washington just for 2 or 3 weeks, you can see what a kind of richness of opinion you can have here. But sometimes it doesn't mean that American foreign policy is then the most enlightened. This is a different question. But so the underlying point would be that what I'm really trying to show is what makes progress possible. And this is I mentioned Max Weber, the sociologist, earlier. He had this metaphor for in modern politics. He said it's like drilling through very thick planks. You need a lot of staying power and determination, even passion. And you cannot have a quick fix. And anyone who suggests that you can have a quick fix is just it's a demagogue, or he's creating false hopes. And I think it's especially demanding in a more democratic society, because you have a very diverse debate. I think nowadays we have a situation, especially in the United States, but also in Europe, where it's so polarized that there's no dialogue. I'm a lot of this book always starts in the ancient world and in Athens and with Thucydides, and they already were thinking, my God, we have such polarized sort of opinions in Athens. But this was a small city-state. Here, if you think of Washington nowadays, just the idea, can we still have some kind of dialogue? Are we just shouting our diverse messages and we don't want to listen anymore? And the same happens internationally. So imagine if you can't even get to some kind of debate within, this is a huge country, but within a kind of context like that, what are the chances to do this internationally? And yet this is what happened in different phases of the 20th century. Now, I'm no expert on the religious and the groups in this, only insofar as I'm interested when they try to have an impact on wider policymaking. Yeah. So if you wanted to ask, I would simply have to make up a tale. If you ask me, so what is the patriarch's underlying position? I can just see the consequences of his actions, and I think that this takes us back to 1919 or the 1940s. Unfortunately, a lot of churches can be very gullible towards becoming national churches or a particular cause. Think of the German example. You had Bonhoeffer and other dissidents and resistors, but they were a minority. The so-called German Christians were making compromises with the Nazi party and completely anti-Christian, the most anti-Christian party Germany in the world maybe has ever seen. So I think it would. So this is the warning sign, that it seems very often in international politics it doesn't help. It sometimes even makes things worse when people see themselves as religious actors. But you can also, the more positive dimension here is, well, it happens to be a Catholic one. That a lot of the kinds of Christian Democrats after 1945 who were trying to do different things in Italy, in Western Germany, and France, they had a sort of more enlightened Catholic understanding of why it was important to go for Franco-German reconciliation and so on. This was something, in the end, I would say, that transcended religion. It was not, for example, limited to their denomination, but the kinds of ideas of a common Christian heritage, a common culture, a common civilization were embedded in a Christian understanding. And of course, then the important question for a modern world order is this a very exclusive understanding that again, sort of creates exclusion towards Jews, of course, the Jewish question that is so important in the first half of this long 20th century, or eventually towards Muslim groups. If you look at France or the Turkish communities in Germany, so it's always this question of is there an underlying more ecumenical, open, sort of truly democratic impetus, or do you have, and you often have had this, a more nationalist, narrower, hierarchical impetus? And I think just as much as there's been a struggle in the general debate in public sphere about these orientations, I would argue probably, but I'm not an expert, that would be more a question to you, this is also something Christians have to be aware of, as they see that there are very different ways in which Christian leaders or God has been evoked to many different ends. And as so I would see this as a potentially helpful, but if we look at Ukraine, I think there's no doubt that the kind of strong ties between the head of the Russian church and the kind of Putin system that also is using just in a very old-fashioned way religious nationalism to mobilize soldiers to fight for brutal barbarian ends is not something that that reminds me more of the Crusades of the Middle Ages. But it's much worse because now the weaponry is much more ferocious.
One more question.
So I thought it was interesting when you noted that Wilson was very keen to not have the U.S. become a sort of militant or imperialistic state like the British in particular, because the British, of course, saw themselves as being exceptional and distinct from the general European rule of being kind of a militant state. So I'm interested in how you kind of understand the ways in which, the extent to which Britain was sort of both a foil and also a model for the U.S. as the U.S. became more engaged in the European security question during and after World War I.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. That's part of the book's architecture, has something to do with what we might call the succession of hegemony. So you have, but it also shows that this is not so clear-cut. If you look at it globally, you have this idea that there was something like a Pax Britannica in the 19th century, but in reality, you have a very complex British world system. Yeah, they are the most influential, but they do not take on certain responsibilities. Yeah? For example, early in the 19th century, you had something like a European concert at the Congress of Vienna. Yeah? So the victors of that war came together, integrated post-Napoleonic France, and said, from now on, no more big war. We will always act in concert. Yeah, we will deliberate. And Britain, in the early stages, was one of the leaders, the primus inter pares of this system. But when Britain became so successful in expanding its world system, yeah, you have this period. It's often been called this kind of glorious isolation or splendid isolation, yeah? Which is a catchword for saying, that's a very early American idea, we don't have to get involved in all these irksome responsibilities. We lead by example and at the same time expand our imperial sphere of influence. Yeah? So they still had some role in this concert, but very often when there was a war between France and Prussia, they did not interfere. Yeah? And so nonetheless, there's a long prehistory that's in the first part of this book, an American tradition, yeah, both of looking towards Britain as a model and of looking as Britain, as you mentioned, as a foil to say how different the United States is. And this is an elite thing, yeah, so it can be nicely exemplified within the Adams family. Yeah, so John Adams traveling to France and then to Britain to negotiate the post-revolutionary ties to make the young United States a viable state. His young son, John Quincy Adams, being exposed to a cosmopolitan upbringing. Yeah? So he's so one of the most cosmopolitan later secretaries of state you've ever seen. In this early phase of American foreign relations. So nonetheless, so he is the real architect of the Monroe Doctrine. Yeah? And the Monroe Doctrine is a wonderful example of how this worked, because it's on one level this great proclamation of the United States that the Europeans were not supposed to interfere in Western affairs and the Americans would stay out. Implicit in this is that if anyone had tested this, the Americans would never have the power to prevent anyone doing this. But John Quincy Adams had an implicit understanding that this was in alignment with British interest. And so the Royal Navy was the real shield that shielded the American Republic. Yet Quincy gave this John Quincy Adams gave this very important speech of the Empire of Liberty and the Empire of Tyranny. And guess which one was what? Yeah, so the Empire of Liberty is the great United States that brings blessings to the North American continent. The bad, old-fashioned empire is the British Empire. Yeah, so it's like having your ally also as a punching ball. And the British, of course, saw this as a sort of adolescent kind of behavior, I guess. But many of the elites, and this takes us to the end of what I call the dawn of the long 20th century. If you think of John Jay, the Open Door Notes, or the Theodore Roosevelt, they were profoundly living in a kind of Anglo-American cosmos. Also, again, Anglo-American Protestant elitist cosmos, sending their offspring to sort of on the European tour and so on. You can read if you read Henry Adams. Yeah, so the next generation about this kind of world, you get a window into this. And so there was this idea before the First World War that wouldn't it be nice if you had a kind of Anglo-American double hegemony? Yeah, sort of the most civilized, the most advanced powers sort of sorting things out. Joseph Chamberlain, a liberal imperialist British, very commercially minded politician, was sort of suggesting this. Theodore Roosevelt reacted to it. In the end, it did not come to this kind of formal alliance, but this takes us to the problems that emerge when in 1919 the British delegation and Lloyd George have all kinds of concepts of a new Atlantic concert. So they think that it would be advantageous to do a kind of burden sharing, to bring the United States in, for example, in guaranteeing French security, at the same time to control these Americans and in a very American way to teach them how things are really done, because they think that they are so inexperienced that the British have to tell them a bit about how for example, how they have to deal with the Middle East. Yeah. And Wilson is a profoundly, so let's say, a politician who does not want to do anything like that because he does not want to go down the road of making the United States a more British European power. Yeah. Nonetheless, if you think about the League of Nations, yeah, Wilson had the general ideas, but the real structure of the League of Nations is British. Yeah. So all the blueprints for the League Council, later the UN Security Council, how this is supposed to work, who has a voice, yeah, this has all been crafted by British experts. And Wilson adopts a lot of that and puts some American language on top. Yeah, but this is very important to understand, that there's a sort of complicated negotiating process. Eventually, yeah, this takes us then to the days of the Atlantic Charter, where you have Winston Churchill giving very powerful speeches of the common mission of the Anglo-American races, while really wanting Roosevelt to do more for Britain, because the relationship had become ever more unequal. So you have the British now saying, we have a special relationship, it's so special, and the American president saying, yeah, it's rather special, but there's much more at stake. So this is the kind of transition that takes us all the way towards a Reagan and Thatcher and so on. And of course, I don't want to comment on the current state of British leadership. Was there leadership? I think not. Yeah, but it's still one of these questions. So what happens if these two states don't see eye to eye or neglect their responsibilities? And I would argue the current crisis of the Euro-Atlantic order has a lot to do with the presidency that this country had before this one. And the British sort of complete going into a self-inflicted massive crisis with Brexit, and Germany not being prepared to take on a more hegemonic role, and a French president giving eloquent speeches but having not the power to do anything like that. So that's a mix where all the actors have to come together in a new way, and you cannot do this without responsible U.S. leadership, but also willingness to take other perspectives on board. And that is why I think formats that encourage dialogue, not just at the top level, but with different actors in Washington and in Europe, is very vital, especially at this stage. And this has been neglected for a long time. And so this is what I hope to make a contribution to in the end. Thank you.